Awesome. Visual perception. Now we're going to be looking at more ways that we perceive things. With the first one being the different monocular depth cues. So how do we actually perceive depth? We have monocular depth cues and binocular depth cues. So what is depth perception? Depth perception is the ability to accurately judge 3D space and distance. And we do this using cues in the environment. So the interesting thing is that our retinas can actually only see in 2D. I'm surrounded by a 3D world, but the image of what I see on the back of my retinas is only 2D. It's a 2D picture that we're actually seeing, which is why these depth cues are, again, they're so important for perception. And there are two types. Binocular depth cues, which is where we use both eyes together to gauge distance and space, or monocular depth cues, where we can either use one eye independently or it can be using both together. Because if, for example, you only have one eye open, you can't use binocular depth cues, but you still need to be able to have a sense of distance and space. So the first monocular depth cue is accommodation, which involves the eye's lens changing shape so it can focus the light rays on the retina at the back of the eye. So we have these little muscles called ciliary muscles, and they control the movement of the lens. So the brain receives this information of what the ciliary muscles are doing, and it actually interprets the tension in the ciliary muscles to determine distance. So depending on how our eye is moving and the accommodation of our lens and ciliary muscles, our brain can actually use that information to kind of judge how far away something might be. The next main one is pictorial depth cues, which are used by artists to create a 3D interpretation of something that exists on a 2D surface. So these pictorial depth cues are how we kind of interpret that something's meant to look 3D, even though it's technically a 2D picture. So the first one is linear perspective, which is the mild convergence of parallel lines as they extend towards the distance. So what's interesting here, for example, the road or the footpath, this line is kind of slightly moving in, and if we could see it, so would the edge of this road as well. Same with these footpaths. We know that these lines are parallel, the road and the footpath is running parallel. But the interesting thing is, if you look really closely, you can actually see that the lines are appearing to mildly converge and get closer together as it recedes into the distance. And that actually creates the effect of it looks like it's receding into the distance. Even though, again, this picture I'm showing you, it's a 2D picture. These cues and everything is just what's helping your brain interpret it as 3D. And the linear perspective, the lines coming together, is just one way that happens. The next one is interposition, which is just a fancy word for overlap. And that's when partially obscured objects are perceived to be further away, and the unobscured object is seen to be in the foreground. For example, the car is in the foreground and the trees are in the background. The trees are partially obscured. So I'm kind of thinking in my head, okay, well, if the car is in front of the trees, then the car must be closer than the trees. That's how I'm drawing that 3D conclusion. And that's really helpful for knowing which is closer, but it doesn't actually help me judge actual distance. Our next one is texture gradient, which is the idea that as the surface recedes into the distance, the texture or the detail decreases. So right up the back of the picture, there's a lot less texture I can see in the leaves, whereas the trees that are closer to me, I can see more leaves, I can see a lot more detail. So I'm interpreting it to be closer because I can see more detail. So I'm using that texture gradient. Next one is relative size. So based on our tendency to perceive the object producing the largest retinal image as being closer. So it's getting into that idea. So again, that first car is producing a bigger size on my retinal image than the last car. So I'm going, well, okay, size constancy, I'm referring to that knowledge. I know that those two cars are a similar size. So the fact that that back car is smaller, it's telling me that it's further away. I know it's not actually smaller, I just know it's further away. So I'm using the knowledge of the real size of that object to make a judgment about, and make a comparison. So it's telling me which one's closer. And the last one is height in the visual field, which shows depth by portraying objects as farther away as being closer to the horizon, which you can see here, because our horizon is kind of like way back here. And this is closest to the horizon and it's furthest away. This is like a little bit lower in the visual field. So I'm perceiving that as like being closer, which again, it's really interesting how all of this knowledge kind of like is coming together to help me perceive this completely 2D picture, but to perceive it as 3D using all of that information. And that brings us to our binocular depth cues. So that's when we're thinking about like how our two eyes are working together to kind of like make sense of the world. So, and our two are retinal disparity and convergence. So the first one is retinal disparity, which occurs because our eyes are actually set 6 to 7 centimeters apart. My left eye is here and my right eye is here. They're actually 6 to 7 centimeters apart, and that's known as our pupillary distance. So the fact that our eyes, they're not in the same spot, they're different. So when an object is within 20 meters, so like close-ish, each eye perceives the image slightly differently, which is so interesting, but the brain fuses the two images together. So what we can learn from that is the more different the object is, the closer it is. If that doesn't make sense, that's okay. I'm going to try to illustrate that. So pick something like in whatever room you're sitting in, like pick something and preferably like a little bit far away and cover it with your thumb. Well, first of all, close one eye. So you should have one eye closed and you should be covering something with your thumb. And then what I want you to do is switch eyes. Open the eye that was closed and close the eye that was open. You'll notice the thing you were covering just moved. Well, it didn't actually move, but that's illustrating that our eyes actually see different things. So if you're ever looking through like a little like telescope or something, for example, if you swap eyes, what you see is going to be different. So that's showing that our eyes are seeing slightly different things. But when something's really far away, it doesn't like have a big of an impact. But when things are really close, it makes a big difference. So the more different the two images our eyes see, the closer it is. And the second one is convergence. So as an object gets closer, our eyes turn inward to keep it focused in the center. So for example, I've got my pointer finger up here. As I'm moving it closer, I can feel my eyes turning in because my eyes have to turn in to keep focusing on it in the center. And the brain actually reads the amount of like turning and angling in the eye muscles, and it uses this to make judgments about how close or far away the object is. For example, I can feel my eyes are really turned in when I'm trying to look right at my nose. But when I'm looking at something far away, my eyes don't need to turn as much because it's further away. So that's like another way that we gauge depth perception.